a photograph that should never move. Welcome to Mystery Sherlock. I am your host, Edward Sterling. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your messages make this better. Now the mystery begins. In the unpublished records which I have from time to time preserved concerning the singular abilities of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes, there are certain adventures so fantastic in their outward aspect that I have long hesitated to place them before the public. I do not speak of those affairs in which governments trembled, nor yet of those domestic tragedies which by their very intimacy cut too near the heart for idle repetition. I refer rather to a small but extraordinary chain of events which began in the winter of 1895 in our old rooms at Baker Street, and which ended in a revelation so curious that, had I not myself borne witness to each step of the inquiry, I might have dismissed it as the extravagant invention of some penny dreadful. It was in the second week of December. A yellow fog had settled upon London with that oppressive persistence known only to the inhabitants of our great city. The lamps shone as blurred orange discs beyond the window panes, and the muffled rumble of wheels in Baker Street came to us as though from another world. Holmes, who was seldom more alert than when the weather drove lesser men into torpor, had spent the greater part of the morning stretched upon the sofa with his long, nervous fingers pressed together, his eyes half closed, and his keen, ascetic face turned toward the fire. To the casual observer he might have appeared indolent. I knew better. The stillness of Holmes was never the stillness of repose. It was the gathering of force, the poised inactivity of the hound before the spring. For my own part, I had drawn my chair nearer the blaze and was engaged upon the notes of a medical paper, when Holmes suddenly broke the silence. "You have omitted your luncheon today, Watson?" I glanced up with some irritation, for I had, in fact, done precisely that, and had not conceived that my neglect was of a nature to interest him. "My dear Holmes," said I, "if you propose once more to dazzle me by deducing a fact which you observed in the most commonplace fashion, I shall insist upon the explanation before the applause." A faint smile flickered across his face. "You are becoming exacting in your old age, my dear fellow. None the less, the matter is simplicity itself. Your paper lies open at a page dealing with gastric disturbances. A medical man does not voluntarily select such reading at the luncheon hour unless he is himself hungry, and perversely reminding himself of the fact. Moreover, Mrs. Hudson carried up but one tray at 1 o'clock, and the odour of kidneys, which ordinarily lingers upon your coat sleeve after these domestic indulgences, is wholly absent. Finally," he waved his hand toward the mantel, "your cigar case, which you use habitually after food, remains unopened." I laughed. "3 facts instead of 1 observation. I retract my protest." "You should never retract, Watson, where you may analyze. The danger in life is not that we are deceived, but that we cease to be curious as to how." He had scarcely uttered the sentence when the bell below rang with unusual violence, followed by the quick, uncertain footfall of a person who is either greatly agitated or wholly unaccustomed to climbing stairs without assistance. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson entered and announced a lady. The visitor who swept into our room was one of the most remarkable women it had ever been my fortune to behold. She was not young, though she still possessed the relics of great beauty. Her figure was tall and admirably carried. Her dress, though disordered by haste, was of a richness too subdued to be vulgar, and her face, pale under the close veil which she immediately lifted, bore that curious union of pride and distress which one associates with women who have long commanded themselves until the strain becomes intolerable. Her eyes, however, fixed my attention at once. They were grey, large, and singularly brilliant, yet so overclouded by terror that I rose involuntarily from my chair. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked. Holmes bowed without rising. "You are fortunate, madam. You have found him in a mood to be useful. Pray be seated. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson, upon whose discretion you may rely as fully as upon my own." She sank into the chair which I drew forward for her, and for an instant pressed her gloved hand to her side as though to steady a heart beating beyond its proper rhythm. "I have come," said she, "because I was told that if any man in England could determine whether I am losing my reason or whether some monstrous design is at work against me, it is you." Holmes leaned back and closed his eyes, a habit which strangers often mistook for indifference. "In either event," said he, "the symptoms should be of interest. Your name, if you please." "I am Lady Morwenna Vale." I observed the swift glance which Holmes shot at her from beneath his lids. The name was not unknown, even to me. Sir Julian Vale, her husband, was a man of means and some social prominence, possessed of an old house near Kensington, and a recent reputation for collecting unusual scientific curiosities. I recalled having seen his name in connection with electrical apparatus, foreign antiquities, and certain photographic experiments which fashionable journals had been pleased to describe as revolutionary. "You come from Campden House," said Holmes. The lady started. "How can you know that?" "Your carriage," said he with a slight impatience. "It bears the Camden crest upon the door, though the fog and your haste caused you to overlook the footman's imperfect concealment of it. Also, the hem of your dress is marked with the reddish gravel used in the drive there, and nowhere else in your quarter, so far as I remember, is that particular stone laid so liberally. You see everything." "I see what presents itself. The question is whether you will present the essential facts." She drew a breath and clasped her hands more tightly. "My husband is dead." The words fell so abruptly and with such dreadful finality that for a few seconds no one spoke. Holmes opened his eyes fully now, and there came into his face that alert, hawk-like expression which I had learned to associate with the first scent of a difficult trail. "When did this occur?" "Last night, or rather he was found last night, at 11:15. "Found where?" "In the photograph room." "The what?" She looked from Holmes to me, as though uncertain whether the phrase would sound as absurd to us as it already did to her own ears. My husband had converted one of the upper morning rooms into a private gallery. He kept there certain portraits, plates, lenses, chemicals, and electrical contrivances connected with his experiments. He called it, rather grandly, the photograph room. It was there that he was discovered. By whom? By me. Holmes steepled his fingers. "You had better begin at the beginning, Lady Morwenna. You will find that a clear chronology is kinder to the nerves than any amount of emotional emphasis. Dr. Watson, perhaps you would oblige with a note or two." I took out my pocket-book as she proceeded, though I confess that from the first sentence I needed little assistance from ink, so strongly was every word engraved upon my memory. "My husband," said she, "had of late become deeply occupied with a particular photograph. It was a portrait taken some 6 years ago in Vienna by an obscure foreign artist whose methods Sir Julian greatly admired. The picture represented—" She hesitated. "Yes," said Holmes. "It represented my husband, myself, and my husband's younger brother, Adrian Vale, shortly before our marriage." Holmes made the faintest gesture. "Go on." "The photograph had long hung in the west corridor of Campden House. I had scarcely regarded it in years. About a fortnight ago, Sir Julian had it removed to his private room. From that hour his manner changed. He had always been a man of enthusiasms, cold perhaps in common intercourse, but intensely alive when some rare object had seized his imagination. Yet this was different, and he would sit for an hour together staring at the thing. Twice I found him with a magnifying lens in his hand, muttering to himself. Once, when I entered unexpectedly, he covered the frame with a cloth as though he had been caught in an indecency. When I remonstrated with him, he answered only that the photograph contained more truth than any painted portrait ever had. I supposed this one of his extravagant phrases. Then 3 nights ago he told me something which has deprived me of sleep ever since. Her voice faltered for the first time, and I saw that she was forcing herself onward with difficulty. He told me, she whispered, that the photograph had changed. Holmes's face remained expressionless. In what manner? He said that Adrian's eyes had altered. Adrian Vale being my brother-in-law. Why, he has been dead these 4 years. Ah. The little exclamation meant much coming from Holmes. He never wasted a syllable. Sir Julian declared, she continued, that in the original portrait Adrian looked somewhat away from the camera, as indeed I remembered him to have done, owing to a slight defect in one eye which made direct gazing painful. Sir Julian insisted that now the dead man's face was turned more fully forward. More than that, he said the eyes no longer wandered, but fixed themselves upon him. She gave a short, nervous laugh. You will think this the babble of a madhouse. Not at all, said Holmes. I think it the babble of a human being under strain. Whether the strain arose from guilt, fear, drugs, or mere vanity remains to be seen. What was your husband's condition otherwise? He slept little, and he locked drawers which had never before been locked. Yesterday morning he sent for Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard, though I did not at the time know why. At this, Holmes gave a quick glance toward me. Lestrade was called in before the death? So I learned later. He came in the afternoon. My husband saw him privately in the library for nearly 40 minutes. When Mr. Lestrade departed, Sir Julian was in a state of extreme agitation, though he attempted to conceal it. At dinner he scarcely touched his food. Afterward he went directly to the photograph room and ordered that he was on no account to be disturbed. Yet he was disturbed. Yes. At 10:30 I became alarmed, for the butler reported that Sir Julian had not answered repeated taps at the door, though light could still be seen beneath it. I went up myself. The door was locked from within. We called his name. There was no reply. At last the servants forced the door. She stopped and pressed her lips together. Holmes waited, and it was one of his many strengths that he could wait better than any man I have known. Silence in his hands was not emptiness but pressure. He was lying near the fireplace, she said at last. Quite dead. You are certain the death was immediate? The house surgeon from 2 streets away said he had been dead perhaps 20 minutes. There was no wound, no sign of violence, and yet his face... She shuddered so violently that I set a glass of water beside her. His face expressed terror, said Holmes quietly. Yes, terror beyond words, and the photograph, well, it lay upon the floor beside him. The glass was cracked. I saw it only for a moment before the police took charge, but I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, that even in that instant it seemed to me that Adrian's eyes were open wider than any human eyes ought to be. Holmes rose now and stood with his back to the fire, his hands beneath his coat-tails, his chin sunk upon his breast. Whenever an account struck him as peculiarly suggestive, he would often withdraw physically from the speaker, as though by removing the distraction of expression he might better isolate the naked sequence of facts. The door was locked, said he. How? With the key. It was found inside. Windows? Fastened? Fire lit? Yes. Any smell of chemicals or gas? I cannot say. There was the usual odour of his photographic solutions. And the body? On the rug. One arm outstretched toward the picture. Who first touched the photograph? I do not know. The servants may have done so before the police arrived. I myself did not. Did your husband have enemies? She looked at him steadily. What man of money and temperament has not, but no one whom I could connect with this? Debts? Some, though nothing alarming. Affairs of the heart? A faint flush crossed her cheeks. Not to my knowledge. Yours, Lady Morwenna? It was a brutal question, but Holmes, when necessary, could be brutal in the interest of precision. She met it with dignity. None which concern this matter. That was not an answer, but it will serve for the present. This Adrian Vale, what was the nature of his death? The lady's fingers tightened once more upon the arm of the chair. I drowned in the Serpentine. Accident? Suicide? Murder? The coroner returned an open verdict. Adrian had been unsettled. He was charming, reckless, and often in difficulties. There were rumours of gaming, of forged notes, of disgrace abroad. My husband was devoted to him once, and then, for reasons I never wholly understood, became estranged. After Adrian's death, Sir Julian would rarely allow his name to be spoken. Holmes nodded. There is family history here. Yes. And probably money? Yes. And most likely, sentiment masquerading as reason. At this, she rose half from her chair. Mr. Holmes, I did not come here to hear my husband insulted. No, then you should have gone to a priest. You came to a man whose business it is to arrange unpleasant facts. Pray sit down. There was that in his tone which brooked no protest. She resumed her seat, though her eyes flashed for an instant. I ask your pardon, madam, said I. My friend's manner is at times economical, said Holmes dryly. Now one further point. Why have you come to me this morning, when Scotland Yard is already involved? Because Mr. Lestrade believes the matter finished. Finished? Yes. He informed me with great confidence that Sir Julian must have died of natural seizure brought on by overwrought nerves. He said the locked door excludes every criminal hypothesis. Holmes gave a soft snort. The locked door excludes only the imagination of the official mind. Did Lestrade examine the photograph? He did. And? He thought it irrelevant. Holmes turned suddenly upon me with the peculiar brightness in his eyes which always heralded intellectual excitement. There, Watson. A death in a locked room, a dead brother's portrait, an anxious wife, a prematurely satisfied Lestrade, and above all, an object dismissed as irrelevant. What more can the heart desire? A less spectral detail, perhaps, said I. The matter of a photograph changing its expression seems scarcely admissible outside a séance. Holmes smiled. My dear fellow, the supernatural is invariably the refuge of those who have not yet mastered the natural. If a photograph blinked, then either it did not blink, or someone had reason to persuade another that it had. In neither case need we invoke the spirits. Lady Morwenna leaned forward. Then you will take the case? Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he crossed to the window and with his long forefinger traced a narrow arc in the condensation upon the pane. I knew that he had accepted already. The ritual of refusal and consideration was merely one of those little dramatic instincts by which he sometimes sharpened his own mind. Before I commit myself, said he, I must know whether there is anything which you have withheld. Consider carefully. A trifle omitted in embarrassment may become a catastrophe in analysis. She hesitated. There is one thing. I do not know whether it matters. Last evening, an hour before Sir Julian locked himself in the room, I heard him speaking there with another person. A man? I believe so. You believe? You did not see? No, the door was closed. Did you recognize the voice? No, it was low and rapid. What was said? Only a fragment. I had come along the passage and was about to enter when I heard Sir Julian say quite distinctly, "If it is seen again, or we are both ruined." Holmes wheeled round. Again? Yes. And the reply? I could not catch it. A moment later there came a sound as though something heavy had been set upon a table. Then I moved away, for I did not choose to overhear. Holmes rubbed his hands in that quick, eager fashion, which was with him the equivalent of another man's exclamation, "Excellent! Excellent!" The unhappy lady stared at him. "You find comfort in that?" "I find direction. It is the one thing in your account which promises to be true because it has not yet been interpreted. Now tell me, who besides the family had access to the house yesterday?" She named the butler, Ames, a parlour-maid, 2 footmen, the cook, Sir Julian's valet, Mercer, and a secretary, Mr. Felix Hurst, who attended him daily upon matters of correspondence and cataloguing. In addition, there had been Mr. Lestrade and, earlier in the day, an elderly photographer named Barstow, who sometimes advised Sir Julian upon technical matters. Was Mr. Hurst present in the evening? Yes, until nearly 9. And this Barstow? He left before luncheon. Did your husband have any children? No. Any expectation of inheritance among relatives? Sir Julian's estate would, in the absence of issue, pass to a cousin in Surrey, though I have independent means of my own. Very good. Holmes took up his hat. We shall go at once. Lady Morwenna rose also, and some of the tension seemed to pass from her face. Then there is hope? My dear lady, said Holmes, settling his scarf with care, there is always hope where there is method. The danger lies in methods applied too late. As she drew down her veil and prepared to leave, Holmes detained her with a lifted hand. One final question. This photograph, was it ever copied? I do not know. Was it framed under glass throughout the 6 years you mention? Yes. Who had charge of it when it was removed from the corridor? My husband's valet and the secretary, I believe. And did you yourself observe any change in it before last night? She was silent so long that I thought she meant to evade the question. At last she answered in a voice scarcely above a whisper. Once. Holmes's eyes narrowed. When? 2 nights ago. I passed the open door of the room. The photograph stood upon an easel beneath a shaded lamp, and I looked in. And for the briefest moment I had the extraordinary impression that Adrian's face was not fixed as in a photograph at all, but watchful. It may have been some reflection in the glass. I told myself so then, and I tell myself so now. Yet I have not forgotten it. Without another word, Holmes opened the door for her, and a minute later we heard the retreating steps upon the stair, followed by the diminished throb of her carriage in the fog. For some little time my companion remained motionless. Well, said I at last. Well, Watson, we have before us a case composed of 3 distinct elements: fear, artifice, and memory, and death. Death is merely the punctuation. The sentence interests me. He moved swiftly about the room, filling his pockets with a tape measure, lens, and note-case, or into an inner compartment he slipped his revolver, an action so unobtrusive that a casual observer might never have detected it, but one which never failed to sober me. You anticipate danger, then? I never exclude it where vanity, money, and a family secret move in company. Put on your thick boots, Watson. We may have occasion to examine the grounds as well as the room. As I prepared myself, I could not but reflect upon the singular nature of the business into which we were entering. A man found dead in a locked chamber might, indeed, furnish enough material for inquiry. A nervous household, an estranged dead brother, and a mysterious visitor would further enrich the puzzle. Yet through it all there ran that one grotesque thread which refused to be woven into any sane pattern. The suggestion of a portrait that altered, watched, or perhaps even lived. I said as much to Holmes while we descended the stair. He paused upon the landing and looked back at me, his hawk-like face sharpened by the dim light from above. "You are wrong, my dear fellow," said he. "There is nothing grotesque in it at all. A thing is either impossible, fraudulent, or misunderstood. If impossible, it did not occur. If fraudulent, we must ask who profits. If misunderstood—" he smiled in that quick, cold fashion of his. "Then the fault lies in the observer. And observers, Watson, are the commonest liars in London." We stepped out into the fog, where the world had shrunk to a circle of lamplight and wet pavement. Our cab was already waiting. Holmes gave the direction to Campden House, and as we drove into the thick yellow gloom, Piggy sank once more into one of those profound silences which with him meant not rest but pursuit. I had seen that expression before, in the copper beaches of Hampshire, in the alleys of the East End, and in the quiet English lanes where murder walks in decent boots. It was the look of a mind already ranging ahead of facts, testing avenues, rejecting appearances and laying invisible lines of approach. Yet for all my familiarity with his methods, I confess that on this occasion a chill, not wholly due to the weather, settled upon me, for I could not dismiss from my imagination the picture described by Lady Morwenna, a dead man at the hearth, his hand stretched toward the shattered frame, and within it the face of another dead man gazing out across the years with altered eyes. It was thus that the case first opened before us. Through fog, I fear, and a woman's whispered assertion that a photograph had blinked, and before the day was out I was to see that very photograph for myself. The drive to Campden House was one of those eerie London journeys in which the world seems reduced to sound rather than sight. The cab wheels hissed upon the wet roadway. Now and then a lamp glimmered and was swallowed again. Once a belated pedestrian loomed spectrally before the horses and vanished with a muttered oath into the vapour. Holmes sat opposite me with his chin sunk upon his breast and his fingertips together. Only the quick light in his eyes showed that his mind was as active as ever. "You observed the lady's gloves, Watson?" "I observed that she twisted them nearly in two, and that one thumb was stained with silver nitrate." "Photographic chemicals?" "Precisely. Yet she had not spoken of entering the room before the body was found. Either she had done so on some earlier occasion more recently than she admitted, or she had handled the photograph itself. In either case, the omission is of interest." "You suspect her, then?" "My dear fellow, I suspect everybody until the facts forbid me. The vice of the police official is to suspect one person and exclude the rest. The vice of the sentimental amateur is to suspect nobody until too late." He relapsed into silence until the cab at last turned beneath a stone archway and rolled up a sweep of reddish gravel to a sombre house whose dim frontage loomed out of the fog like the stern of some great black ship. 2 lamps burned on either side of the portico, and in their light I saw a butler standing with that rigid composure by which trained servants endeavour to disguise household panic. We were admitted at once and shown into a long library where a fire burned low between dark shelves and a shaded lamp threw a mellow circle over a writing table littered with unopened correspondence. The room had the oppressive air of wealth interrupted by catastrophe. Everything was in order, yet nothing seemed at ease. A tall, spare man with hard features and a face as dry and yellow as old parchment stood upon the hearthrug. I recognized Lestrade. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," said he, with that mixture of cordiality and professional caution which your official detective so often assumes toward a private rival. "Lady Morwenna has been ahead of you, I perceive." "She has been behind the facts." "Aye, which is more serious," Holmes returned. "You have settled the case already, I understand." Lestrade shrugged. "A gentleman with a weak heart, highly strung, alone in a locked room, frightening himself into a seizure over some fancy or other. I don't deny the details are queer, but queer details are often the trimmings of a plain business." Holmes removed his gloves finger by finger. "And the photograph?" Lestrade's mouth tightened slightly. "A family portrait, cracked in the fall. I dare say it upset him if he'd worked himself into one of those nervous states. There's nothing in it." "That," said Holmes, "is exactly what I feared you might say." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Well, you can see it for yourself. I have touched nothing beyond what was necessary. The doctor has been and gone." "The servants are at hand if you wish statements." "Later. The room first." Lestrade led us upstairs by a broad staircase and along a corridor lined with portraits whose dim faces floated in the half-light with an effect far from cheerful. At the western end he stopped before a stout oak door, now standing open, and motioned us within. It was a singular apartment, half sitting-room, half laboratory. A coal fire smouldered in the grate. Along one wall stood cabinets containing lenses, trays, bottles, and photographic plates. There were several framed pictures upon easels, a large camera mounted upon a brass stand, and near the centre a heavy table strewn with papers, measuring instruments, and a shaded lamp with a green silk cover. The curtains had not yet been drawn back, so that the room remained enclosed in a dusky, artificial twilight. Upon the hearthrug, outlined faintly where the body had lain, there was a darker impression. Beside it, leaning against a chair, stood the photograph. I took an involuntary step nearer, for the thing exercised at once a morbid fascination. It was a cabinet portrait, enlarged and mounted under glass in an old, dark frame. The three figures were posed in the formal manner of the period. Sir Julian seated, younger and fuller-faced than in life. Beside him, Lady Morwenna, standing with one hand upon the back of his chair, and a little behind them, Adrian Vale, handsome, slender, and unmistakably the more vivid spirit of the group. Even through the slight crack which ran across the glass, the younger brother's face had a remarkable quality. The eyes, at first glance, did indeed appear to meet one with a directness so unusual in such portraits that I understood, without sharing, the dead man's obsession. Holmes had dropped upon one knee before the hearth. He did not even glance at the picture until he had examined the rug, the fender, and the floorboards immediately around them. "No sign of struggle," said Lestrade. "No second set of footmarks either. The weather helps us there. The windows haven't been opened." Holmes crossed to them at once. They were tall French casements, heavily curtained, each secured by an inner latch. He tested them carefully, then bent to inspect the sill with his lens. "Dust displaced here," said he. Lestrade joined him. "By the maid this morning, no doubt." "No, the dust remains upon the outer edge. It is the inner line only that has been brushed, and recently." "Still, and the windows fast. Now, yes." Lestrade stared. Without answering, Holmes turned to the photograph at last. He lifted it delicately, holding it so that the lamplight struck across rather than into the glass. At once his expression sharpened. "Watson, come here." I stood beside him. He pointed not to the faces, but to the lower corner of the frame. "Do you observe anything?" "At first sight, nothing." "At second?" I bent closer. Along the inner edge, just beneath the cracked glass, there was the faintest irregular line, as though the backing had at some time been disturbed and then imperfectly resealed. "It has been opened," I said. "Exactly, and more than once, unless I am mistaken." He set it down again and turned, his eyes travelling slowly round the room until they rested on the heavy table in the centre. Upon it stood a rectangular object draped in black cloth. "What is that?" he asked. Lestrade lifted the covering. Beneath it was another photographic apparatus, though of a type unfamiliar to me, fitted with a projecting hood and a small viewing lens at the rear. Holmes uttered a low sound which was almost a whistle. "Indeed," said he softly, "this grows less spectral and more human at every instant." At that moment there came a faint tap at the door, and the butler entered with a face so composed that only his ashen lips betrayed him. "If you please, sir," said he to Lestrade, though his eyes strayed anxiously to Holmes, "Mr. Felix Hurst begs to know whether he may leave the house. He says he has already been detained beyond endurance." Holmes straightened. "On the contrary," said he, "Mr. Felix Hurst will do us the kindness of remaining exactly where he is." Lestrade cast Holmes a quick, questioning glance, but there was that in my friend's manner which discouraged interference. "You think him concerned in this?" he asked. "I think him concerned in leaving," returned Holmes, "which is a habit I discourage until I understand its necessity. Pray have him shown into the library. We shall join him presently." The butler bowed and withdrew. Holmes remained motionless for a moment, his gaze still fixed upon the apparatus upon the table. Then with a sudden energy he began to move about the room, examining each object in turn with that swift yet methodical attention which never failed to astonish me. "Watson," said he, "you will oblige me by noting the position of that lamp." "It stands upon the table, slightly to the right of the apparatus. And its shade?" "Green silk, tilted so as to cast the light downward." "Good. Now observe the chair beside the hearth. It faces the table, and the photograph where it now rests would, when upright, have been visible from that chair?" "Clearly so." Holmes nodded. "Lestrade, you say the body was found with one arm extended toward the photograph?" "Yes, as though he had fallen forward from the chair." "Then we may reconstruct the sequence thus far. Sir Julian seated himself there, facing both the photograph and this contrivance. He was engaged, whether in observation or experiment we shall determine, in some relation between the two. Something occurred which caused him to rise or half-rise, extend his arm toward the picture, and collapse." "Heart failure," said Lestrade stubbornly. "Perhaps." "But induced by what?" He bent suddenly over the table and lifted a small metallic instrument resembling a shutter mechanism. "Exposure regulator," he murmured. "And here, plates prepared in advance. Hurst is not merely a secretary, I think, but an assistant in these pursuits." "You attach importance to him, then?" I asked. "I attach importance to anyone who wishes to leave a house in which a man has died under circumstances not wholly explicable." He turned again to the photograph, and this time, instead of examining the frame, he studied the faces intently. I watched him, and I could not but admit that there was something disquieting in the effect. It was not that the features had altered. That, as Holmes had said, must be either illusion or fraud, but that the younger man's expression possessed a vitality which contrasted oddly with the fixed composure of the others. "You see it?" said Holmes suddenly without looking at me. "I see that the eyes appear unusually direct. More than that, the alignment of the pupils differs from what one would expect in a subject who, as we are told, could not gaze steadily. Then the photograph has indeed been altered? Not necessarily altered. Substituted, perhaps, in part? Or supplemented? The question is by whom? And for what purpose? Lestrade gave an impatient movement. Are we to believe that someone tampered with a portrait in order to frighten a man to death? Holmes smiled faintly. My dear Lestrade, men have been frightened to death by less elaborate means, but we must not assume the effect was the intended result. It may have been, how shall I put it, an unforeseen consequence. He crossed once more to the window and stood with his back to us. Lady Morwenna spoke of a visitor last night, a man whose voice she did not recognize. We must discover whether that visitor entered by the door or by some less conventional route. The door was locked afterward, said Lestrade. Afterward, yes, but before. Lestrade hesitated. There is no sign of forced entry. Holmes tapped lightly upon the window latch. There seldom is when one possesses a key. You think the visitor had one? I think it more likely than that he passed through solid oak. He turned back abruptly. Come, Watson, let us see this Mr. Felix Hurst. I have a curiosity to know whether his impatience arises from innocence or from knowledge. As we descended once more to the library, I found my thoughts divided between the tangible and the intangible elements of the case. Holmes had already reduced much of the mystery to questions of access, manipulation, and motive. Yet the image of that photograph lingered with me still, and I could not wholly shake the uneasy impression that, however rational the explanation might prove, we were dealing with something which had been designed to play not only upon the eye, but upon the mind. Mr. Felix Hurst rose as we entered. He was a man of perhaps 35, well-dressed, with a pale, intellectual face, and eyes which, though steady, had in them a certain strained brightness. He bowed slightly, but I observed that his gaze flickered at once toward Holmes, as though he recognized in him a more formidable examiner than Lestrade. "I am told," said he, "that I am not at liberty to leave." "For the moment," returned Holmes pleasantly. "It is a small inconvenience compared to the permanent one which has overtaken your employer." Hurst's lips tightened. "I fail to see how my presence can assist you." "On the contrary, sir, I think it may prove essential." "You were with Sir Julian yesterday evening?" "Until 9 o'clock." "And after that?" "I returned to my rooms in Bloomsbury." Holmes seated himself and motioned us to do the same. "Then perhaps," said he, "you will begin by explaining why a man who left at 9 should be so anxious to depart again before noon." Hurst met Holmes's gaze without flinching, though I saw that his fingers, to resting upon the back of a chair, tightened perceptibly. "I am anxious to leave," said he, "because I have already answered Mr. Lestrade's questions and because I see no advantage in prolonging my detention. My business here is finished." "Your business with Sir Julian, you mean?" said Holmes quietly. "If you choose to put it so." "I do choose to put it so, and I further choose to inquire what that business was." Hurst hesitated, then shrugged slightly. "I acted as his secretary. I catalogued his collection, maintained his correspondence, and assisted him, when required, in certain experimental matters." "Photographic?" "Partly." Holmes leaned forward. "You are familiar, then, with the apparatus in the room above?" "I am." "And with the photograph which appears to have occupied Sir Julian's attention of late?" A faint shadow crossed Hurst's face. "Yes." "Had you observed any change in it?" Lestrade shifted impatiently, but Holmes's eyes remained fixed upon the man. "I am not given to fancies," said Hurst. "Nor am I. That is why I ask whether you observed any alteration, not whether you believed in it." Hurst paused before answering. "The photograph had been adjusted." "In what manner?" "The lighting, the contrast. Sir Julian was experimenting with methods of enhancing certain features, bringing forward details not readily visible to the naked eye. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the quick flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. Indeed, and these methods, were they purely chemical? No. There were optical devices involved, lenses, projection, and this second apparatus upon the table. Hurst glanced up involuntarily. Well, that was part of it. Explain. It is difficult to describe briefly. Sir Julian believed that by combining certain reflective techniques with controlled illumination, it might be possible to— He broke off, as though conscious of the inadequacy of his own words. To animate the image, said Holmes softly. Hurst gave a short, nervous laugh. Not animate, Mr. Holmes. That would be absurd, but to create the illusion of movement, a shift in perspective, perhaps. The eye is easily deceived under the proper conditions. And was it deceived? Hurst did not answer at once. I assisted him in preparing the setup, he said at last. Beyond that, I cannot say what he saw. Holmes rose and began to pace slowly before the hearth. You left at 9, said he. At that time, was Sir Julian alone? Yes. No visitor? None that I saw? Holmes stopped. That you saw? Yet Lady Morwenna heard a voice. Hurst's composure faltered for the first time. I cannot account for what Lady Morwenna may have heard. Let us leave her aside then. When you quitted the house, did you take anything with you? Nothing. Did you return? Certainly not. Holmes turned sharply. You are quite sure of that? Hurst flushed slightly. I think I should remember if I had. Memory is a treacherous faculty, said Holmes, particularly when it is under strain. Lestrade struck in at this point. Come, Mr. Holmes, we are getting no further. The man says he left and did not return. There is no evidence that he did. There is always evidence, said Holmes mildly. The question is whether we have yet perceived it. He moved to the writing table and took up a sheet of paper, glancing at it only long enough to note its blankness before laying it down again. Mr. Hurst, said he, you spoke of assisting Sir Julian in his experiments. Did those experiments involve the use of more than one photographic plate? Yes. Were duplicate images made? On occasion. Of this particular photograph? Another hesitation. Yes. Holmes's voice became very quiet. And where are those duplicates now? I do not know. Not in the room above? No. Not among Sir Julian's effects? No. Then they are elsewhere. Hurst's lips compressed. I suppose so. Holmes inclined his head slightly as though acknowledging a point gained. One final matter. You are aware, I presume, that Sir Julian consulted Mr. Lestrade yesterday afternoon? I am. Did he inform you of the subject of that consultation? No. Did you ask? I did not think it my place. Holmes regarded him steadily. No, your place, I imagine, lay elsewhere. There was a moment's silence. Then Holmes turned abruptly to Lestrade. I should like to see the servants one by one, particularly the valet, Mercer, and afterward, if you please, we will return to the room above. There are 1 or 2 points which require verification in the presence of this gentleman. Lestrade nodded, though with evident reluctance. As you wish. Hurst made a slight movement, as though to speak, but checked himself. Holmes resumed his seat, his long fingers steepled once more, and as I watched him I knew that the case, which had seemed at first so clouded by vagueness and superstition, was already taking shape in his mind along lines at once precise and inexorable. Yet for all that, one question remained unanswered, and it was the one which troubled me most. If the photograph had been manipulated, if illusion rather than impossibility lay at the heart of the matter, then who had arranged it so carefully and to what end? And why had Sir Julian Vale, a man of intelligence and experience, allowed himself to be so completely mastered by it that he had died, as it seemed, in sheer terror before his own creation. The interview with the servants yielded less immediate illumination than Holmes had perhaps anticipated. Yet, as I had often observed, he was never discouraged by the absence of obvious results. On the contrary, he seemed to gather energy from each negative answer, as though the narrowing of possibilities brought him nearer to some hidden centre of truth. The valet, Mercer, proved to be a thin, pale man with an anxious manner and a habit of moistening his lips before speaking. He had attended Sir Julian for nearly 5 years and appeared genuinely shaken by his master's death. "You assisted in moving the photograph from the corridor?" said Holmes. "Yes, sir, Mr. Hurst and I together." "At whose direction?" "Sir Julian's, sir." "Did he give any reason?" "Only that he wished to examine it more closely." Holmes watched him narrowly. "Was the frame opened at that time?" Mercer started. I could not say, sir." "You could if you would." The man shifted uneasily. "Mr. Hurst handled it more than I did. There was talk of cleaning the glass, sir."
"Well, I remember that." "Cleaning?" murmured Holmes. "And was it cleaned?" "Yes, sir." "By you?" "No, sir, by Mr. Hurst." Holmes inclined his head slightly as though marking the statement for later use. "Now, Mercer, attend carefully. Did anyone visit Sir Julian yesterday evening after Mr. Hurst had left?" The valet hesitated. "I cannot say for certain, sir." "You heard nothing?" I thought I heard a step upon the back stair, sir. But it is an old house, and the boards creak at times." "At what hour?" "Between 10 and half past, sir." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And did you investigate?" "No, sir. I had no orders to do so." "Quite so. And the windows of the photograph room, were they ever opened at night?" "Not to my knowledge, sir. Sir Julian was particular on that point." Holmes dismissed him with a nod, and we next saw the butler.
Ames, whose evidence added little beyond confirming the sequence already known, the locked door, the forced entry, and the position of the body. When the last of the servants had withdrawn, Holmes stood for some moments in silence, his head bent, his brows drawn together in thought. Then he turned abruptly to Lestrade. "You will observe," said he, "that we have now 3 points of interest. First, the photograph has been tampered with under the pretext of cleaning. Second, a visitor, or at least a presence, was perceived upon the back stair at an hour when the master was supposed to be alone. Third, certain duplicate plates are missing." Lestrade shrugged. "Nothing there that cannot be explained in a natural way." "Exactly. The natural way is what we seek." He turned to me. "Tea, come, Watson. We return to the room, mister. Hurst will accompany us." Hurst, who had remained standing near the window, gave a slight start. "If you insist." "I do more than insist," said Holmes. "I rely upon your assistance." We ascended once more to the upper room, and I confess that the atmosphere seemed even more oppressive than before. The dim light, the silent apparatus, and above all the presence of that singular photograph combined to produce a sensation which I can only describe as expectant, as though the room itself retained some echo of the event which had so recently occurred within it. Holmes closed the door behind us and at once crossed to the table. "Now, Mr. Hurst," said he, "you will oblige me by demonstrating the use of this apparatus." Hurst hesitated, then stepped forward. "Then—"
"It is not in working order at present. That difficulty will not deter you." With a reluctant air, he adjusted the position of the lamp and drew the black cloth once more over the instrument. Then, bending to the viewing lens, he made a slight movement with his hand, as though turning some concealed mechanism. "Under proper conditions," said he, "the light would be directed through a prepared plate and reflected upon the photograph," said Holmes. "Yes." "And the effect?" A change in appearance, a deepening of shadows, a suggestion of movement. Holmes nodded. Precisely. Now I beg you to repeat the process, but this time, Watson, you will observe the photograph. I took my place before it, my eyes fixed upon the face of Adrian Vale. Ready? Said Holmes. Hurst made the adjustment once more. For an instant, nothing occurred. Then,
I so subtly that I could scarcely have sworn to it, there came a shift in the expression, a slight alteration in the direction of the gaze, as though the eyes had indeed moved a fraction toward me. I started back involuntarily. "You saw it?" said Holmes quietly. I believe so." "An illusion," said Lestrade. "An illusion carefully contrived," returned Holmes, "and one which, under certain conditions of mind, might well produce a profound effect." He turned suddenly upon Hurst. "And who devised this?" Hurst's face had grown very pale. "Sir Julian." "Alone?" "I assisted him." "To what end?" Hurst's composure broke. "I do not know. He would not tell me. He said only that the truth must be seen, that the past could not be hidden." Holmes's expression became singularly intent. "The past," said he. "Yes. We are coming closer." He moved slowly toward the photograph and stood before it, his eyes fixed upon the face within. "And yet," he murmured, "there is something here which even you have not explained, Mr. Hurst." The man looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Holmes raised his hand and pointed. "The eyes," said he. "They do not merely seem to move. They have been altered." Holmes remained standing before the photograph, his tall, spare figure outlined against the dim glow of the shaded lamp. For a long moment he did not speak, and I could see that his mind, having gathered all its scattered threads, was now weaving them into a single, unbroken pattern. "You perceive it now, Watson?" he said at last. "I perceive that the eyes are not those of a man who could not gaze directly," I answered. "They are fixed, intentionally so." "Exactly. And not enhanced, not illuminated, but replaced." Hurst gave a sharp exclamation. "That is impossible!" Holmes turned upon him with a sudden energy. "On the contrary, sir, it is the only possible explanation. The photograph has been opened, imperfectly resealed, as I have already shown. A portion of it has been substituted. The original image of Adrian Vale, with its wandering gaze, has been altered to produce this unnatural fixation." Lestrade frowned. But to what end? A trick of that sort might amuse a man, but it would hardly kill him. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back. "No, Lestrade, not unless the man already feared what he was meant to see." He crossed slowly to the hearth and stood where Sir Julian had fallen. "Let us reconstruct the final scene. Sir Julian sits here. Before him, the photograph, now altered. Behind or beside him, this apparatus, capable of projecting subtle changes, movement, emphasis, a suggestion of life. He has already convinced himself that the image is changing. Perhaps he has even assisted in that illusion, but beneath the illusion lies something deeper, something he alone understands. He turned to Hurst. "You spoke of truth, of the past that could not be hidden. What truth, Mr. Hurst?" Hurst shook his head, but his face had lost all colour. "I do not know." Holmes's voice hardened. "You do know, or if you do not, you suspect? Sir Julian did not embark upon this elaborate deception for amusement. He sought confirmation, perhaps confession. The photograph was not merely altered to frighten, it was altered to accuse." There was a dead silence. "Accuse whom?" said Lestrade at last. Holmes's eyes moved from one face to another. Adrian Vale did not drown by accident." Lady Morwenna, who had entered unnoticed and now stood near the door, gave a low cry. "You cannot mean—" "I mean precisely that," said Holmes. The open verdict was a convenience, not a conclusion. Sir Julian knew more of his brother's death than he ever admitted, and in recent weeks some discovery, led him to revisit that knowledge. He turned again to Hurst. "You assisted him in reconstructing the photograph, but you did not originate the idea. Who did?" Hurst's composure collapsed entirely. "It was not I," he cried. "He came to me with it already in mind. He said the plate was wrong, that it concealed something. He made me open it, replace the eyes, adjust the expression. He said he must see him as he truly looked that night." "What night?" demanded Lestrade.
"It's the night Adrian died." Holmes nodded slowly. "And what did he see, Mr. Hurst?" The man covered his face with his hands. He saw recognition, not fear, recognition, as though Adrian had known him, as though he had seen— "Seen what?" said Holmes sharply. Hurst's voice dropped to a whisper. "Seen who pushed him." A profound silence followed. Even Lestrade seemed momentarily at a loss. "You are suggesting," said he slowly, "that Sir Julian—" "I suggest nothing," said Holmes. "I state that Sir Julian Vale believed himself to have been recognized at the moment of his brother's death. Whether that belief was justified is another matter. But once awakened, it became an obsession." Lady Morwenna stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "You are wrong," she said. "My husband was not a murderer." Holmes bowed slightly. "I do not accuse him."
Madame, I explain him." He turned once more to the photograph. "Consider the sequence. A man burdened, perhaps unconsciously, by guilt. A photograph which captures a moment connected to that guilt. A mind already inclined towards scientific manipulation and illusion. He alters the image, not merely to deceive others, but to confront himself. He uses projection, light, and substitution to create the appearance of movement, of life. And at last, in the solitude of this room, he achieves what he believes to be proof. The dead man looks back at him directly, knowingly. "And he dies of fright?" said I. Holmes inclined his head. "Of terror, or of shock brought on by that terror. The human mind, Watson, is capable of generating its own executioner." Lestrade cleared his throat. "Then there is no crime?" Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, there are two. One lies in the past, beyond our reach. The other," he turned his keen gaze upon Hurst, "is nearer at hand." Hurst started. "I have done nothing." "You have assisted in the alteration of evidence. You have withheld material facts, and if I am not mistaken, you returned to this house last night." "That is not true." Holmes stepped swiftly to the window. The latch was opened from within and re-secured. Mercer heard a step upon the stair. Lady Morwenna heard a voice. "Sir Julian spoke of ruin, shared ruin. You came back, Mr. Hurst, because you feared what your employer might reveal." Hurst's resistance crumbled. "I came only to reason with him. He had become unbalanced. He spoke of going to the police, of exposing everything. I told him it would destroy us both. He would not listen. He turned on me. He pointed to that cursed picture and said Adrian had known—" "And then?" said Holmes. "I left him. I swear it. He was alive when I went." Holmes regarded him steadily. "I believe you. You are not a murderer, Mr. Hurst, but you are a coward, and a poor judge of consequences." Lestrade stepped forward. "I think we shall have a few more questions for you at the yard." As he led the broken man away, the tension in the room seemed, at last, to lift. Lady Morwenna sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Holmes approached her with unexpected gentleness. "Madam," said he. "You have lost your husband under tragic circumstances, but you have not lost him to the disgrace you feared. Whatever his past, his end was the result of his own mind, not the act of another." She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "And the photograph?" Holmes took it up and, with a sudden, decisive movement, removed the cracked glass and tore the altered portion cleanly from the mount. "It will trouble no one again." We left Campden House as the fog began at last to lift from the streets. The lamps shone more clearly now, and there was a stir of life returning to the city. As we rode back to Baker Street, I turned to my friend. "You have solved the case," said I, "and yet I cannot say that I feel wholly satisfied." "No," said he, "there is something unsettling in it still." Holmes lit his pipe and leaned back against the cushions. "My dear Watson," said he, "there is nothing more unsettling than a mind at war with itself. We seek villains in the world, and often we find them. But sometimes—" He paused, and a faint, rare shadow crossed his keen features. "Sometimes the villain sits alone in a locked room and requires no accomplice." He fell silent then, and I, watching the thinning fog drift past the window, could not help but reflect that of all the strange cases in which I had accompanied him, this was one in which the most terrible force at work had been neither trickery nor violence, but the quiet, relentless pressure of a guilty conscience upon a brilliant mind. And that perhaps is a mystery no man can ever wholly solve.